If you've ever watched someone walk into a room and felt the temperature drop, you already know what it felt like the night Jae-won Shin stepped through the door of Mellow Brown's Diner. And if you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now, because the story you're about to hear is going to stay with you long after it's over. Like the video, drop a comment, and let's get into it. The door didn't slam. It didn't need to. Jae-won moved with the kind of quiet that only men who never had to raise their voices possessed. The kind of quiet that had put 3 men in the hospital last Tuesday and erased a business rival's entire financial portfolio by Thursday. He was 34, lean and controlled, dressed in a charcoal overcoat that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Behind him came 2 of his men, Soo and Deepening, both keeping exactly 2 steps back the way they always did, the way they'd been trained to. Jae-won didn't like people walking beside him. It implied equality. The diner was nearly empty at 11:15 on a Wednesday. A couple in the far corner nursing coffee. An old man asleep over a newspaper. And behind the counter, wiping down the surface with the slow, unbothered rhythm of someone who had absolutely nowhere else to be, stood Amara. She didn't look up when they came in. That alone was unusual. Most people looked up. Most people felt him before they saw him, some animal instinct in the spine that said, danger, recalibrate, adjust. Amara just kept wiping the counter. And when she finally turned around and said, sit wherever, she said it the way someone says good morning, automatic, empty of performance. Jae-won noticed. He slid into the corner booth, his preferred position in any room, back to the wall, full sightline to the door. Soo and Deepening took the adjacent table. Nobody handed them menus. Amara dropped 3 on the table without being asked and walked back to the counter. Jae-won stared at the back of her head. She didn't even look at you, Deepening said quietly, half amused, half nervous about whether that was the right thing to say. Jae-won didn't respond. He opened the menu. The reason they were here at all was ugly. 3 hours ago, his Lieutenant Park had walked into a meeting with projected numbers for a reinvestment portfolio. Commercial properties, a logistics company, 2 restaurants, and the numbers were catastrophically wrong. Not wrong like a rounding error. Wrong like someone had been skimming the analysis, cutting corners, feeding Jae-won comfortable projections instead of real ones. For $1 million was sitting in a structure that was actively bleeding. Park had panicked in the meeting, started talking fast, started explaining. Jae-won had held up one hand, and Park had gone silent mid-sentence. That was an hour ago. Park was currently waiting by his phone, wondering if he still had a job, or worse. Jae-won had driven around for an hour before pulling into this diner, because he needed to think somewhere that wasn't his office, somewhere that didn't smell like the decisions he still had to make tonight. And now he was sitting in a vinyl booth under fluorescent light, trying to figure out how to restructure $4 million without anyone on the outside noticing the wound. Amara came back. What are you having? Coffee, Jae-won said. Black. Food. No. She wrote nothing down. Just looked at Soo and Dae-young. They ordered quickly, like men who were hungry but knew not to take too long. She left again. Dae-young leaned forward. Park is going to come up with an explanation by morning. Park's explanation is not my problem, Jae-won said. The structure is my problem. He built on assumptions instead of actuals. The whole reinvestment model is inverted. We're prioritizing capital deployment over liquidity positioning. In a tightening cycle. He said it almost to himself, jaw tight, turning the coffee cup Amara had just placed in front of him without a word. Dae-young blinked. Soo looked at his food. You want me to get someone to look at it? Dae-young offered. Who? Park built it. His team built it. Jae-won's voice stayed flat. Every analyst I have right now has been looking at numbers through the same flawed lens for 8 months. I need an outside perspective, and I need it from someone who doesn't know enough about my operation to be dangerous. There was a short silence. Then Deepening, trying to lighten the weight in the air, nodded toward the counter where Amara was plating food. Ask her, he said, grinning. Outside perspective. Soo snorted. Jae-won looked at Amara. She had her back to them, moving efficiently, unbothered. He picked up his coffee. The joke was obvious. A diner waitress, financial strategy. He knew Dae-young was just trying to crack the tension. But something about the way she moved, no wasted motion, no performance, everything deliberate, made him set the cup down. He called out just loud enough. Hey, Amara turned. "Come here a second." She walked over with the same unhurried pace. "Need something?" Jae-won leaned back in the booth, and there was a slight curve at the corner of his mouth that his men recognized as the version of a smile he gave right before he said something he found privately amusing. "I've got $4 million sitting in a commercial property and logistics split. The position is losing liquidity in a tightening market. My guys structured it around projected growth instead of current yield. What would you do with it?" Deung was already pressing his lips together to keep from laughing. Amara looked at Jae-won for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, "Pull 60% out of the logistics position immediately. That sector's getting crushed by fuel cost restructuring right now, and anyone projecting growth and it hasn't looked at actual freight data in 6 months. Rotate it into short duration yield. Keep the commercial property, but renegotiate the debt structure to interest only for 18 months while the rate environment settles. Stop treating the two positions as one portfolio. They have completely different liquidity timelines, and blending them is what's bleeding you." She picked up an empty coffee cup from the table. "Anything else?" The table was silent. Dae-young's smile was gone. Amara walked back to the counter. Jae-won stared after her. The coffee in his hand had gone slightly cool. He didn't notice. He came back the next night. Amara saw him come through the door at the same time, 11:20, and felt the small, controlled satisfaction of someone whose plan was proceeding exactly on schedule. She didn't show it. She grabbed a menu she already knew he wouldn't use and walked it to the corner booth without being asked. "Coffee," she said. "Coffee," he confirmed. She brought it. He didn't try to talk to her immediately. That was new. Most men who walked in with this kind of energy needed to dominate the room within the first 5 minutes. Jae-won just sat with his phone and his thoughts and his coffee like he owned the silence and didn't need to prove it. Amara noted this and filed it away. She had been working mellow grounds for exactly 11 weeks. She had taken the job 3 days after she identified this diner as the closest civilian location to the intersection of Jae-won's 2 primary legitimate business corridors: a commercial property management company called Shin Holdings and a private logistics contractor called KDP Freight. Both companies served as the cleaner surface of a syndicate operation that had been quietly strangling minority-owned businesses in 4 districts through a loan structure that was technically legal and practically predatory. High-interest emergency business loans offered through a third-party lender that traced back through 2 shells and a dormant holding company directly to Jae-won. Amara had spent 4 months tracing that chain before she ever set foot in this diner. She wasn't a federal investigator. She wasn't a journalist. She was something harder to categorize. A woman who had watched her mother's catering business get devoured by exactly this kind of loan structure 11 years ago in a different city run by different men with the same playbook. Her mother had borrowed under pressure, missed one payment during a slow quarter, and watched the penalty clauses activate like a trap. Lost the business in 7 months. Amara had been 19. She had spent every year since becoming the kind of person who understood the trap well enough to dismantle it. She had a master's degree in financial economics from a university she'd paid for herself. She had 3 years of experience in structured finance at a firm she'd quietly left when she realized her skills were being used to build the same wall she'd grown up behind. And she had a network, small, careful, invisible, of 7 community business owners across 3 districts who were currently enrolled in what appeared on paper to be a small financial literacy cooperative, but was actually a sophisticated rerouting operation. Amara was slowly, methodically moving their debt exposure off Jae-won's lending chain and restructuring it through a combination of credit union instruments and micro-investment vehicles that his analysts wouldn't recognize as a threat until it was too late. She needed 2 more things to complete it: time and access to the internal liquidity calendar of Shin Holdings, which would tell her exactly when to execute the final moves before his collection cycle triggered. That calendar lived somewhere inside Jae-won's operation, and Jae-won was sitting in her section every night ordering black coffee. She refilled his cup without being asked. He looked up from his phone. "The logistics position," he said, like they were mid-conversation. "You said freight data. Where would you have pulled that?" Amara didn't miss a beat. Bureau of Transportation Statistics releases monthly. Cross-reference with the spot rate index from DAT Freight. Takes about 40 minutes if you know what you're reading. He studied her. You do this regularly. I read things, she said simply. Where do you study? Does it matter? His eyes held something that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite suspicion. It was the look of someone recalculating. No, he said finally. I suppose it doesn't. She walked away. She could feel him watching her. Over the next 2 weeks, he came in 6 more times. Each visit he stayed longer. Each visit he asked her something. Sometimes financial, sometimes structural, once a single question about risk psychology that she answered in 4 sentences that made him set his phone face down on the table and just look at her. His men stopped making jokes after the 3rd visit. They'd started bringing notepads on the 5th. Amara gave him just enough each time. Not everything. Never everything. She calculated her answers the way a chess player considers a move. Not just what it reveals, but what it makes him want to come back for. What she hadn't calculated was the way he listened. Most powerful men listen to information the way they ate. Quickly, extractively, moving on before they'd fully tasted anything. Jae-won listened like someone who had learned that the space between words was where the real content lived. He was still. He watched her mouth when she talked, not in the way that made her skin crawl, but in the way of someone concentrating, catching every syllable. When she finished answering, he didn't rush to respond. He sat with it, sometimes for 10 full seconds before he said anything. It was, against every calculation she had made, unsettling. She told herself it didn't matter. Unsettling was not the same as dangerous. She was not here to feel things. She was here to finish what she started for her mother, for the 7 business owners quietly depending on her, for every person who had borrowed in desperation and paid in devastation. She believed that right up until the night, everything started falling apart. It was a Tuesday. She was in the back of the diner on her break, running numbers on her phone, when a message came through from Jerome, the owner of a Jamaican restaurant in the 3rd District, 107. The message was short and made her stomach drop. Someone came in today, not from the bank, asked questions about the cooperative, said they were doing a financial compliance review. Amara, they knew your name. She read it twice. Then she sat very still for 30 seconds and thought clearly about what this meant. Someone inside the lending chain was running a parallel investigation. They'd found a trace, not enough to expose everything, but enough to know a name. Her name, which meant the operation she'd spent 8 months building was now on a clock she hadn't set. She needed the Shin Holdings liquidity calendar, not in 3 weeks. Now, she walked back out to the floor. Jae-won was in his booth, coffee untouched, which was unusual. He was looking at something on his phone with the flat expression he wore when something was costing him money. She made a decision. She walked to his table, pulled out the chair across from him, and sat down. He looked up sharply, the first time she had ever seen him look genuinely startled. I need to talk to you, Amara said. Not as a waitress. The diner had thinned out to almost nothing. The couple in the far corner had left. The old man with the newspaper was gone. Sue and Deung were at the adjacent table, and both of them had gone very still the moment Amara sat down. The stillness of men reaching for instincts they weren't sure whether to use. Jae-won looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, without looking at his men, "Give us the room." Dae-young opened his mouth. "So, Jae-won's voice didn't change in volume or temperature. It didn't need to. Both men stood and moved to the far end of the diner. Jae-won set his phone face down on the table and gave Amara the same quality of attention he gave nothing else, complete, unblinking, and absolutely unreadable. "Talk," he said. Amara had rehearsed this moment in her mind for weeks. Not this specific moment, because she had not planned to do this yet, but a version of it. She knew what she would say, what she would offer, what she would withhold. She had run the logic 17 times in 17 variations, and in every version it was clean and controlled, and she was fully in command of the room. But sitting across from him now, under the direct weight of his attention, she felt the rehearsed version leave her like air from a punctured tire. What remained was something more honest and considerably more dangerous. Someone inside your lending operation is running a compliance review on people I'm connected to, she said. They have my name. I need to know if that came from your side or from someone working around you. Jae-won didn't move. What people you're connected to? Business owners, small operations, people who took emergency loans through a third-party lender that connects to your holdings through two shell structures and a dormant company registered in Busan. The silence that followed was the longest she had ever sat inside. She watched his face. Nothing moved in it. Not a jaw muscle, not a blink, and she understood viscerally in that moment exactly how men feared him. It wasn't the threat of violence. It was the total absence of reaction. It meant he was computing something she couldn't see, and whatever he decided in that space, she would have no warning before it arrived. "You've been tracing my corporate structure," he said finally. "For 4 months before I took this job," she said. "Yes." Another silence. Shorter this time. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because whoever is running that review isn't doing it for you. They're using your infrastructure to find something they want for themselves. And if they burn my operation to do it, whatever they're really after is going to cost you more than you're prepared for." He tilted his head slightly. The first movement he'd made. "You're telling me there's a threat inside my organization, and your reason for telling me is to protect your operation." "Yes. Not because you trust me." "No." Something shifted in his expression then, so brief she almost missed it. Not quite a smile. Something that lived in the same neighborhood as respect. "What do you want from me?" Amara held his gaze. "Access to the Shin Holdings liquidity calendar. Internal. The real one, not the one that goes to your accountants. And in exchange, I restructure your $4 million bleeding position correctly. Not the 60% patch I gave you 2 weeks ago. The full architecture. And I tell you exactly who inside your operation is running the side play." He said nothing. She kept going, because the silence wasn't a no. It was an audit, and she needed to give him enough to complete it. "I know what I'm asking for. I know what it costs you to hand that to someone outside your operation. I'm not asking because I think you trust me. I'm asking because the alternative is we both take damage we don't need to take from a threat that's using us against each other." Jae-won was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past the diner window. The fluorescent light above them buzzed once. "You sat in my section," he said slowly, "for 11 weeks. You answer my questions. You gave me exactly enough to keep me coming back." He paused. All of that was deliberate. "Yes," she said. "You chose me. I chose this diner. You chose this section." His eyes narrowed. "That's a careful distinction. I'm a careful person." He stood up then, not abruptly, not with anger, but with the controlled motion of someone who needed to move while they thought. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, hands loose at his sides. She watched him. Dae-young, from the far end of the diner, watched Jae-won. Sue watched Amara. Then Jae-won turned around. "I'll give you access to the calendar," he said, "if your information on the internal threat is verified by my team within 48 hours. Not before. 48 hours gives them time to move on my people," Amara said evenly. 48 hours is what I'm giving you. You want different terms. You have something more to offer." She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them blinked. "Fine," she said. 48 hours. She stood up and picked up his coffee cup. Muscle memory, a waitress reflex, and then caught herself and set it back down. He noticed. She turned to go. "Amara." She stopped. He had never used her name before. She realized she didn't know how he knew it, and understood immediately that this was the point. He was telling her something without saying it. That he had known more than he let on. That she was not the only careful person in this diner. "Whatever you're building for those business owners," he said quietly, "it's not small. Someone inside my operation wouldn't be looking for you if it was small." She didn't respond. She walked back to the counter. She stood there for a moment with her back to him, breathing steadily, and thought about the fact that the most dangerous part of her plan had always been the variable she could not control. Not his organization, not the shell structures, not the collection timelines. The variable was him, and he was considerably more complicated than she had planned for. If you're still with the story, drop a comment right now. Tell me, Team Amara or Team Jae-won? And if you haven't liked the video yet, do it now. Things are about to get a whole lot more complicated. The 48 hours moved like a hell breath. Amara gave Jae-won a name. Min-suk, his third-tier operations manager for the lending subsidiary. Min-suk had been quietly building a file on the cooperative for 6 weeks, not on behalf of Shin Holdings, but on behalf of a rival faction within the syndicate, a man named Cho Byung-soo, who had been orbiting Jae-won's operation for 2 years, waiting for a structural crack wide enough to push through. Min-suk had been his inside man. He'd found Amara's network not through direct investigation, but through a payment pattern anomaly in the loan repayment data. Businesses that should have been defaulting were somehow stabilizing, and the source of that stabilization pointed, faintly but unmistakably, towards something coordinated. He hadn't found everything, but he'd found enough to make her a leverage point. Jae-won's verification took 19 hours. When he called her, on a number she had not given him, which told her everything she needed to know about how seriously he was taking this. His voice was the same flat temperature it always was, but there was something beneath it that had gone tight. Min-suk has been removed, he said. And Cho. A pause. Cho is a larger conversation. That means he's still out there. That means I'm handling it in the correct sequence. Another pause, and then something she hadn't expected. He said her name again, quieter this time. The calendar will be sent to an encrypted address. Give me something to send it to. She gave him the address. 2 hours later, the file arrived. She sat with it at her kitchen table at 2 in the morning with cold coffee and 3 notebooks and spent 4 hours going through every line. The liquidity calendar was exactly what she needed. A detailed timeline of when Jae-won's lending subsidiary ran its collection windows, when funds were transferred between entities, and most critically, when the system was at its most exposed to external restructuring. There were 3 windows in the next 45 days. She needed to move all 7 businesses through those windows cleanly, severing their debt ties to his chain without triggering the penalty clauses. It was meticulous, grinding work. She loved it. She also knew, sitting there at 2 in the morning, that she was in something she had not fully anticipated. She had expected to use Jae-won's infrastructure without him ever knowing she existed. Instead, he knew her name. He'd handed her his most sensitive internal document, and she had told him the truth about who she was. None of that was in the original plan, and she was a person who lived inside her plans the way other people lived inside their homes. It was the structure that kept everything intact. She thought about the way he'd said her name. Not Amara, the waitress. Not Amara, the woman running a play on my network. Just her name, like a period at the end of a sentence. Like a thing he wanted to keep in his mouth a moment longer than necessary. She closed her notebooks, went to sleep, told herself it was just a complication. They met 3 more times over the next week. Not in the diner. A park at 7 in the morning, Jae-won in running clothes that looked like they had actually been run in, Amara with coffee she'd made herself because she didn't trust anything bought near his territory right now. A parking structure on the 2nd floor where his car sat between 2 empty spaces. Once, briefly, at the back entrance of a building he owned, because she needed to show him a document and she needed him to understand the timeline they were working against. Each meeting was professional, transactional. They talked about structures and timelines and threats and strategy. He was precise and fast, and she never had to explain anything twice. She gave him the full architecture for his $4 million restructure. Not just the bleeding position, but a complete overhaul of how Shin Holdings was categorizing its mixed-use assets, a reclassification framework that would reduce his tax exposure and make the whole portfolio significantly less visible to outside scrutiny. He listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he asked 2 questions that cut directly to the 2 weakest points in her proposal, and she answered both. And he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You're good at this." It wasn't a compliment, exactly. It was closer to an acknowledgement. The way you say the sky is blue. Not because you think it's beautiful, but because you've looked at it closely enough to confirm it. "I know," she said, and something in the way he looked at her shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way either of them could have pointed to directly, but she felt it, a reorientation, the way a room feels different when someone moves the light source. He had been looking at her as a variable, something to calculate. She could feel the moment he stopped. She didn't address it. Neither did he. But the next morning, he sent a message to her encrypted address with no text, just a location and a time. And she went because the part of her that was still pretending everything was purely operational told her it was necessary. And the part of her that had started to be honest with herself said nothing at all, because it was still learning the shape of something it hadn't named yet. The location was a small private office above one of his legitimate restaurants. He was already there when she arrived, standing at a window with his jacket off for the first time she'd ever seen. He looked not smaller without it, just less curated, more like a person. On the desk, between them, was a printed document. She recognized it before she got close enough to read it. The format, the font, the structure of a loan agreement from his subsidiary. Her mother's name was at the top. She went completely still. "I pulled historical files when I started looking into what you were building," he said quietly. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the document. "I found the 2013 collection action, the penalty trigger, the seizure." He paused. The business was called Grace Occasions Catering. Amara said nothing. Her chest had constricted into something she refused to let reach her face. "My predecessor ran that subsidiary," Jae-won said. "I inherited the structure. I've known for 2 years that it was predatory. I haven't dismantled it because..." He stopped. He turned from the window and looked at her directly. "I haven't dismantled it because it was profitable and I told myself the structure was legal." The silence in the room was enormous. "Why are you showing me this?" Her voice was steady. She was proud of how steady it was. "Because you deserve to know that I know," he said. "And because I'm shutting the subsidiary down. Not because of her deal. I decided this morning." He picked up the document and held it out to her. "I thought you should have this." She took it from him. She looked at her mother's name. She thought about Grace Bempa, 61 years old, who still talked about the catering company she'd built from nothing with a grief she wore so quietly most people never noticed it. Amara folded the document carefully and put it in her jacket. She looked up at Jae-won. "That doesn't change what I was doing," she said. "I know. I was still running an operation against your network. I know that too. And you're not." "No," he said simply. "I'm not." She studied him. He stood there and let her. And for the first time since she had walked in a mellow ground 11 weeks ago, Amara felt the careful architecture of everything she had built start to tremble. Not because it was failing, but because something outside the plan had turned out to matter. The threat didn't wait for either of them to finish processing what had happened in that office. Cho Byung-soo moved on a Friday, which Amara learned afterward was deliberate. Fridays were when Jae-won's senior team was most distributed, handling end-of-week collections across 3 districts. Cho had been patient for 2 years, and he had planned this with the kind of precision that told her he had resources she hadn't accounted for. It came at Amara first. Not physically. Cho was smarter than that. It came through the cooperative. 3 of her 7 businesses received official-looking compliance notices from a regulatory body on Friday morning. Notices that were convincing enough to trigger panic and real enough in format to do serious damage if they circulated. Jerome called her in a state she had never heard him in. So did Kezia, who ran a hair supply distribution company in the 2nd district. The third was a man named David who had a printing business and 2 children and had been sleeping 4 hours a night for 6 months trying to keep his doors open. He didn't call. He sent one message that said, "I'm going to have to close." Amara was already moving. She called Jae-won while walking to her car. He picked up on the first ring, which told her he already knew something was happening. "Cho served notices on 3 of my people," she said. "I know. He also hit 2 of my legitimate operations. Filed fraudulent liens through a ghost creditor he's been building for 8 months. Jae-won's voice was controlled, but she could hear something beneath the control now, a current of cold fury that had its own kind of heat. "He's not coming for my criminal operations, Amara. He's coming for everything above the surface. He wants the legitimate structure because that's what's worth the most, and that's what would hurt the most to lose. He's using my people as a distraction," she said, reaching her car. "He knows you'll have to split attention." "Yes." Which means the real move is coming today. He wouldn't file the notices and then wait. "Agreed." A pause. "Where are you?" She told him. 15 minutes later, Sue pulled up in a black car that had the specific blankness of a vehicle that didn't want to be remembered. She got in without discussion. Jae-won was in the back. His jacket was on. His face was the mask again, the one with no temperature. But his eyes, when he looked at her, had something in them she recognized. The same thing she was carrying in her own chest. Not fear exactly. The particular tension of caring about an outcome too much. Cho is going to move on a commercial property in the 4th District, Jae-won said. It's the anchor asset in my legitimate portfolio. If he executes the lien transfer before I can counterfile, I lose it, and it unravels the collateral chain on 4 other holdings. He paused. I need someone who can file a counter-instrument in the next 3 hours that's clean enough to hold up and aggressive enough to stop the transfer. Amara looked at him. You need me? Yes. She thought about the 7 businesses, about David and his printing shop and his children, about the fact that Cho burning Jae-won's legitimate structure would also collapse any chance of a clean exit for her people, because the chaos would trigger collection actions across the board while everything was in motion. I'll file the counter-instrument, she said. But while I'm doing that, you need to get someone to hand-deliver withdrawal notifications to those 3 businesses before end of business today. Not the subsidiaries process, direct withdrawal. Your signature. No conditions. Jae-won looked at her for a moment. 3 businesses, pulled from the collection cycle on a Friday afternoon by the signature of the man who ran the operation. It was not a small thing. It was not reversible. And he wouldn't be doing it as a trade because she was already committed to helping him whether he agreed or not. They both knew that. Done, he said. She spent the next 2 hours in the back of a moving car with her laptop on her knees and Jae-won's corporate attorney on speaker, building a counter-instrument from scratch. It was the most technically demanding thing she had done in years. Not because the structure was unfamiliar, but because the clock was hostile and every line had to be precise enough to withstand a challenge from someone who had been planning this for 8 months. She made no errors. She did not allow herself errors. Jae-won sat beside her and said nothing. He didn't lean over to watch. He didn't ask questions. He simply stayed present in a way that felt strange, as it was like a hand at her back. Not guiding, not directing, just there. She found it steadier than she expected. The counter-instrument was filed at 4:47 p.m. Cho's lien transfer was halted at 4:52. In a property registry office in the 4th District, the most dangerous move Cho Byung-soo had spent 8 months building arrived 5 minutes too late. Amara closed her laptop. She was aware of how tired she was only because she had stopped moving and the tiredness had finally caught up to her. She looked out the window of the car. The city moved past. Lights coming on as the evening settled in. Ordinary people finishing ordinary days, entirely unaware that 2 people in a black car had just quietly stopped something from unraveling. He's not done, she said. No, Jae-won agreed. But he's exposed now. He used his best instrument today, and it didn't land. He'll try to recover, and when he does, I'll know exactly where he moves from. Amara nodded. Then, because she was tired and the professional scaffolding she usually kept precisely in place had been under extraordinary pressure all day, she said something she hadn't planned to say. David has 2 kids, she said. The printing business. He borrowed $40,000 under your subsidiary structure 2 years ago. He's paid back $63,000, and they keep telling him he still owes because of the compound penalty clauses. She paused. He's been sleeping 4 hours a night. Jae-won said nothing, but she heard him. The quality of his silence said he heard her. I know, he said finally, quietly, like it cost him something. The car moved through the city. Neither of them spoke for a while. But it wasn't the silence of 2 people with nothing to say. It was the silence of 2 people who had said enough and were sitting inside the weight of it together. Cho Byung-soo made one more move. He made it 6 days later, and he made it at the diner. Amara had gone back to work, partly because walking away from her shift would draw attention she didn't need, and partly because the diner had become, in the strange compressed way that intense weeks sometimes reshaped ordinary places, somewhere she needed to be. She was behind the counter on a Tuesday evening when 2 men she didn't recognize came in and sat at the counter and ordered nothing and looked at her in the way that men who are delivering a message look at the person they're delivering it to. The message was from Cho. They didn't say his name. They said the name of her cooperative, the name of Jerome's restaurant, and the name of the encrypted address she used. Then one of them slid a phone across the counter, showing a photo of her mother outside Grace Bempa's apartment in Accra. Amara looked at the photo. She looked at the man. She felt something cold and clear move through her. Not fear, but a very precise form of fury that had been 11 years in the making. She said, "Give me 1 minute." She walked to the back of the diner, took out her phone, and called Jae-won. He arrived in 11 minutes. She knew because she counted. She had gone back to the counter and refilled the two men's water glasses without being asked because her hands needed something to do and because she refused to give Cho the satisfaction of watching her break her own composure. When the door opened and Jae-won walked in, not with two men this time, but with four, and with the particular quality of presence that made the entire diner recalibrate in an instant. The two men at the counter understood immediately that the message had not had the intended effect. What happened next was not violent. Jae-won didn't need violence for this. He sat at the counter 2 seats from a man, ordered a coffee, and spoke in a voice pitched only for them. Amara didn't hear all of it. She heard enough. She heard Cho's name. She heard a set of very specific financial information that told Cho's men that Jae-won knew every account, every asset, every leverage position Cho held. She heard the words 48 hours to close the operation and leave the city. She heard the words, or I begin making calls. The two men left without their water. Jae-won sat at the counter alone. Amara poured his coffee. For a moment, neither of them said anything. It was almost companionable, the silence of people who had been through something together and were on the other side of it. "Is your mother safe?" he asked. "I called my cousin 20 minutes ago. She's with her." Amara set the coffee pot down. Cho used her to try to stop me. He knew everything else hadn't worked. Jae-won looked at his coffee. "It won't happen again." She believed him. That was the part she hadn't expected. Not that he would say it, but that she would believe it without needing it explained. "The 7 businesses are clear," she said. "The last 3 went through yesterday. They're off your subsidiary's chain completely. The cooperative is restructured and self-sustaining. If you shut the lending subsidiary down like you said." "It's already closed," he said, "as of last Friday." She went still. "You didn't tell me." "I didn't need to tell you. I told you I was going to do it." She looked at him. He looked back. And it was there between them then. All of it, the entire complicated architecture of the last 3 months, everything that had been said plainly and everything that had been said in the space between words. The plan she had made without him. The way he had sat in her section every night. The name on the document. The car. The 2 hours of silence while she built a counter-instrument that saved something that mattered to him. The photo of her mother. 11 minutes. "I chose this section of the diner," she said quietly. That part was deliberate. He nodded once. The rest of it wasn't. He was quiet for a moment. Then, something she had never seen on his face before. Not the almost smile, not the cold calculation, not the controlled fury, but something open and unguarded that looked, frankly, a little like someone standing on unfamiliar ground and choosing not to step back. "I know," he said. Amara picked up the coffee pot. She refilled his cup even though it was still 3/4 full, which she never did, which was exactly the kind of involuntary human thing she had spent 3 months refusing to let herself do. She set the pot down. She didn't move away. "I'm not going to be a waitress here much longer," she said. "I'm setting up a proper financial advisory practice. Community-focused. I have 3 clients already and 2 more conversations scheduled." "I know," he said again. And then, with the smallest possible version of that almost smile, the one she had learned, over 11 weeks and 11 more weeks of something harder to name, meant he was genuinely pleased by something. "I already told 2 people I know to call you." She stared at him. "Legitimate businesses," he said. "Both of them. You can verify." She didn't know whether to laugh. She thought she might. That itself was extraordinary. A week later, when Jae-won walked into the diner one last time, out of habit, or something that had become indistinguishable from habit, she wasn't behind the counter. She was sitting at his booth. His usual booth, corner table, back to the wall. 2 cups of coffee already poured. He stopped when he saw her. Just for a second, That half-second of recalibration she had come to recognize as the version of surprise he allowed himself. He walked over. He sat down across from her. He picked up the coffee. "You planned this too?" he said. She looked at him over the rim of her cup. Her mother's catering business was gone and could not be returned. But 11 families across 4 districts were keeping their doors open this month, and next month, and the month after that because of what she had built quietly and what he had chosen to let stand. She thought about that. She thought about what it cost him and what it cost her and what they had both, somewhere in the middle of a plan that had outgrown its original shape, decided was worth it. Not this part, she said. And for the first time in the entire 3 months she had known him, Jae-won Shin smiled. Not the almost smile. Not the controlled, calculated version he handed out like a card. The real one. The one that changed his whole face. Amara picked up her coffee and looked at it to give herself a moment to breathe. Some things she was learning could not be planned, and some things that could not be planned turned out to be exactly what you needed. That is the full story of Amara and Jae-won, 2 of the most dangerous minds in the same room, on opposite sides of the same wound, finding their way to the same table. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm that this kind of storytelling matters, and it helps more people find it. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there are more stories just like this one coming, and you do not want to miss what's next. Drop a comment and tell me, what was the moment you felt the shift between them? Was it the document with her mother's name, the 11 minutes, or was it 2 coffee cups already poured? Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.